Hello and welcome back to I Don't Know Who Needs to Hear This. I'm Lauren and I'm here with Gabrielle. And today we have what is likely to be a two-part episode related to sort of this concept of a high needs baby. So, what is a high needs baby and what does that journey look like for parents and what's really going on? And Gabrielle has a lot of really great things to share with us. She dipped her toe into this a little bit on Instagram a while back. So I'm definitely excited to get in and talk about all the things that are kind of surrounding this concept.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited to talk about this. And yeah, I do use that term high needs on my Instagram, and I have for a while. But as I've evolved in parenthood personally and then also professionally, I've started to see maybe some like cracks or some nuance to using that label that I want to explore further personally, and in this podcast and this conversation, because I think the term high needs has a lot of connotation to it, both positive and negative. And I think that there are certain ways that we can use that language that is ways we can use that language that's helpful and ways we can use it that is not so helpful. So definitely want to dive into that a little bit more. And I'll start by just kind of giving background on how that label even came into my language and my sort of experience with motherhood. So if you don't know, my son is 2.5. He's going to be 3 in a couple months. And we just had like a lot of challenges in his early childhood, early infancy. I think I talked about that more on kind of our first episode a little bit, and I talk about it on my page a lot. So if you're not familiar, a lot of that is there. But we dealt with a lot, and I just felt like he had a lot of needs for closeness and regulation, proximity. He spent months, probably close to a year, sleeping on my chest. I couldn't even get him like next to me on the bed for a very, very long time until fairly recently. Would need a lot of just feeding and co-regulation and lots of big feelings and big expressions of those feelings from a very early age. And it just always felt like a lot, like from the beginning. And at one point, I was on the website for Postpartum Support International, and I was looking at some of like the support groups that they offer, and kind of seeing, is there anything there that might be helpful for me because I was just like dealing with a lot. And some of the ones on there, of course, are for like postpartum anxiety, depression, things that are really really helpful. And then I did see one pop up that said a support group for parents of high needs babies, and I had never seen that label before, never like knew what it was. And so I looked more into like what that group was about, and I just felt like it was describing my son. And so I had this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is my son, this is what I'm experiencing. So I joined that group, and it was helpful to kind of be in a conversation with other moms who were going through the same thing. However, I did also feel at the same time this sense of like sort of, I don't know how to describe it, like sadness or depression of like feeling really down, like discouraged. That's discouraged. I felt discouraged in that group as well because I felt like there's just like a lot of sadness and sort of like putting this label on babies, which led me to start thinking like, is this a helpful label? Is it not? Like, what does this really mean? So I did kind of start referring to my son with love as a high needs baby and really delving into that label a little bit. I made a lot of content about it just to kind of give a little summary of what a high needs baby is, or like what that definition means and where it comes from. You could probably find it in a lot of different literature at this point because it's become pretty widely used. However, it was originally used by Dr. William Sears, and he uses that label to describe a baby who exhibits certain characteristics such as being intense, demanding, unpredictable, needing to be fed frequently, held frequently. They wake a lot. They need a lot of support and closeness. It kind of goes hand in hand with temperament, or as part of temperament in a lot of these conversations. And it is meant to be sort of a label for these babies that helps parents feel less alone in their experience and be able to find like a sense of community, or at least an explanation for their babies, how they're feeling, kind of reassure parents that they're not doing anything wrong. This is just how some babies are. And I think that when we use that label, we lose sight a little bit of what the sort of average normal baby is and what that average baby looks like from a biological standpoint, anthropologically, historically, what is a baby? What are their needs? What do they require and what do they ask for? And if we go back in history and we go to kind of just basic biological needs that babies have had for all of human history, they need to be held. They need to be close. They're wired for that. They are designed to be in a relationship with a caregiver who is deeply attuned to their needs and being able to co-regulate and follow their cues and be in that relationship. And people have been baby wearing for all of human history, co-sleeping, staying close to their babies, breastfeeding, like all these things that kind of have been associated with a baby who is challenging or difficult or high needs are at their core like really just normal baby needs. And I think that we need to have some nuance in that conversation when we're using that label of high needs. So yeah, I'll pause there for a second. I'm curious, kind of, Lauren, where your thoughts are, anything you want to add, because this is definitely something I'm passionate about, and I know you are too, and you kind of, had similar um, thoughts and conversations with this label and other labels about babies.
Well, yeah, I definitely, we had very similar experiences. And like the first, I don't know, 20 months of my son's life were very similar. And I too, that is how I was introduced to sort of the concept of high needs is I actually think we went onto the same website and were likely probably in the same Facebook group.
Probably.
So I also kind of felt I get like discouraged is a good word. And it was like such a like mixed bag of feelings because I was like so grateful to be in community with parents who kind of understood what I was navigating because I was running into a lot of like all babies do this and a lot of being dismissed. So I was like so happy to be in a space where people understood that I wasn't just talking about a baby that like cried sometimes and I was talking about a baby who like had these problems all the time that was struggling to soothe, like even with contact and all of those kinds of things. And I, at that point, just really didn't have the knowledge that I have now. So I didn't understand temperament and I didn't understand a lot of those things, like this difficult temperament trait that
Yeah.
people have renamed as, highly sensitive or spirited or things like that, because it doesn't feel good to say like difficult. And I
Yeah.
think like I think it's like 40% of the population fall into this easygoing. So it does make
Mhm.
sense that if you get online or you public space and you're kind of sharing like your challenges, you are likely to be met with someone who doesn't understand if 40% of the population is navigating parenthood with an easygoing baby. And you
Yeah.
really do have a completely different parenting experience if you
Yeah.
are parenting an easygoing baby. And it becomes very easy to sort of associate that experience with your parenting, and
Mhm.
perhaps not so much that's the case. Um, so I just felt really lucky to have found that because it gave me a lot of terms that, even though now I think some of those are problematic, um, kind of got me into other things. Like that was sort of like
Yeah.
the gateway for me to really understanding temperament. And I think, you talked a little bit about temperament, and I think another important piece of that is like the dyad and like
Mhm.
goodness of fit. And I,
Yep.
I know that you have a lot to say on that too, but we just really like he was one certain way and I was very one certain way, and
Mhm.
it was not like we had a really hard time with each other, and that
Yeah.
is I think really not talked about enough because there's
Yeah.
some like component of like shame or it doesn't feel good to say that,
Mhm.
but like we were very incompatible sensory wise and like
Yeah.
my nervous system and his nervous system, and he wanted things from me that were very hard for me
Mhm.
to give to him. And so I think it's all just really complicated, but all variations of normal. Like
Yeah.
when we talk about like this more difficult temperament, that is still a variation of like normal biological, like sort of this spectrum of which we can see development occur.
Yeah.
Um, and it's very complex in that it depends on like yours as well. So like
Hmm.
nobody's looking at the same thing. It's not comparing apples to apples. It just gets really sort of muddy when you're trying
Yeah.
to kind of navigate that.
Yeah, totally. And I think, yes, I want to go back to like the goodness of fit, too, at some point in this conversation. But something that, I really keep coming back to when we talk about this label high needs is that it almost feels like a misnomer to use that because babies are inherently high needs. Like that's how they are. That's how they're born. Babies are inherently high needs living creatures. They're born very immature in terms of what they're able to do, what they're not able to do, how much they need us. They're high needs by design. So it almost feels like this might be a bit of a stretch, but we tend to default to like a baby who is kind of easygoing temperament. You're able to put them down, they kind of just chill. Seeing that as sort of the default baby, and then the baby who can't do all those things is high needs. But I would almost, make the argument that the opposite is true, whereas a baby who really wants to be held frequently, wants a lot of closeness, needs a lot of co-regulation, that is the default. That is the average, biologically designed baby. And the baby who's kind of just chill and has a relaxed temperament, nothing is wrong with that baby. There's nothing like bad about that, but that is the outlier. That baby who has kind of that more easygoing temperament and can be put down to sleep, from day one, and can feed, on a schedule, or doesn't wake frequently overnight, or doesn't need to be held for naps, whatever it may be. That's kind of the outlier compared to what is expected from babies, in that biological historical lens. So that's my argument there a little bit, is that I think,
Yeah.
high needs is kind of the default, and kind of what we should expect from babies. And then if they do out with that more easygoing temperament, that might be the more of the outlier.
Some of that is like in the literature. So James McKenna talks about it's that baby that is sleeping through the night, not signaling, not waking to feed, that is sort of more atypical, and that sort of introduces some level of risk there because
Mm-hmm.
waking is protective, the feeds are protective, and those kinds of things. So I think that when we're talking about sort of these needs that babies have, and the goal is to get them to be more convenient, um,
Yes.
like there's like downsides to that as well.
The baby that does, need you, that often needs you 24/7, is really kind of the norm. And obviously there's varying ranges of that, and varying causes of as to why they need you. And those are some things we'll get into also, because of course there are reasons why a baby might need a parent or caregiver more than another baby, and those are very valid reasons. But I think where the waters get a little muddied is when we kind of pathologize normal infant behavior and normal infant needs, and put this label on them that maybe gives parents some sense of validation, reassurance, but also again makes them feel kind of discouraged or sort of desperate for answers or for solutions, feeling like their parenting experience is harder than others, when in reality I would guess that there are more parents out there with these babies that have quote unquote high needs than we realize, and they're probably more common than like we think. But again, there's like a shame associated, or kind of this feeling of guilt that it's something that we did as the parents, or something is wrong with our babies, when that's not the case at all. Because it is so true that, babies are wired to need us. They're wired to need us close. They're wired to have a caregiver who's in tune with their needs and in that relationship with them. That's how they survive, and that's how humans have survived for all of human history. So to kind of, again, put a label on that or pathologize that unnecessarily, I think, becomes a little tricky. And something that I go back to whenever this conversation comes up is, there's a quote by, her name's Karen McMillan. She's on Instagram as, I think her Instagram is, where is it? It's Mother's Truth, or we can link it in the show notes. But she, did some writing, and there's a quote that she says on there where she says at the end, "Some babies just need us more." And I go back to that like very, very regularly in my head and in my work with families, because that really is what it comes down to, is that some babies need us more. Some babies just need us more. Some babies just need us less. And there's nothing necessarily wrong in either direction. And a baby who does need us more is not abnormal or a problem or too spoiled, too attached, like any of those things. Some babies just need us more. And I think that can be a really reassuring thing for parents to hear. I do want to make sure that we are getting into the situations where maybe a baby needing you a lot is, again, a sign of something different or something that deserves more exploration or more work. But I think it's good to have kind of this general conversation first of what is a high needs baby? What does it mean? And how can we sort of use that label for good and not for discouragement or making parents feel more isolated?
Yeah, I think it's really hard because like it's not what parents want to hear, and it's not like the
Hmm.
trendy thing, and we have sort of, especially with like social media, and you have like a
Yeah.
lot of sort of like parenting influencers that
Yeah.
put up a 3-minute reel, and there's a baby sitting in a swing or something, and that mom is working out and
Yeah.
cleaning and cooking, and she gets like a whole day's worth of stuff done while her baby, like, that isn't realistic, and that
Hmm.
is sort of what is pushed out in front of parents. And so that can really do a number if you are in the throes of that and you're like, I can't put my baby down to go pee
Yep.
without them escalating and then it being really difficult to settle them. There's a really big disconnect there. And I think it can get really tricky when you are desperately like seeking an answer or like a validate like a piece of validation or something. And something I've seen online recently is like this discussion around low sleep needs. Like a lot of
Hmm.
people are putting out information around low sleep needs. And it's not like a new concept. Like in 2022 or 2023, I did a post on low sleep needs. So it's not like something new, but there's
Hmm.
definitely a lot of posts circulating right now about it.
Yeah.
And so I've gotten a few messages about like, how do I know what this is? And so, like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of parents who are reaching out to me right now just because of this influx of posts who are convinced that their baby is low sleep needs. And as we sort of talk through it, they're not. But there's been sort of just, it's just kind of been out there in people's
Hmm.
algorithms. And when you're living that, it can be really easy to fall into something that you relate to. And maybe that's not, does that make sense? Like maybe that's
Yeah.
not really what's going on. Um, but like if you have, and like there's all of this narrative that your baby should be sleeping 12 hours overnight and napping for 3 hours during the day. And so that adds to it. Like it just
Yep.
builds this case for my baby is low sleep needs, even though we can
Yep.
look at a chart that is, evidence based,
Yep.
and see that no, your baby who has a 12 or 13-hour total sleep need is on the low end of a normal variant.
Yep.
And that is still harder than a baby with a
Yes.
16-hour sleep need, but that doesn't mean that your baby is low sleep needs.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I feel like I'm having a lot of these conversations and I'm like ripping away the validation that they just received because they're like, oh my gosh, I finally figured it out. My baby is low sleep needs. And I'm like, actually, this is like something that is totally expected and can be
Yep.
really variable. And I think the same is true for sort of this temperament, high needs
Yep.
spectrum that we're seeing. And that the intent is not to like pull away that validation. It is
Right.
still really challenging to have a baby with a different temperament than someone else. And
Yep.
a lot of that is a baby being a baby.
Hmm.
And something that I think that you and I talked a little bit about beforehand that I can't wait for you to get into is that our perception of this worsens like if you are out of sync with your
Yeah.
baby. And that is so true for me because I am a very task driven. I assign my worth to my productivity. And
Hmm.
so that was part of our like goodness of fit mismatch because I
Yep.
wanted the house clean. I didn't want a dish in the sink. But he needed me to not be that person. He needed me to focus somewhere else. And so a big part of our mismatch was like I was not attuned to his needs and I was more attuned to mine and what I was needing. And another thing that I think that you'll talk about is that I didn't know him well. Like I didn't
Yeah.
know that about him and I knew myself better. I had been living with myself for a very long time. And so that's what I was leaning into. And it
Yeah.
took me, he had some like speech delay stuff too. So it took me a really long time to like, he was probably 3. And I think
Hmm.
we've talked about it before where I can look back on videos and I have a lot of guilt because I know in a second what he wants and I can watch
Yeah.
myself be misattuned
Yep.
with him. And it is like heartbreaking for me because I know
Hmm.
how frustrated he must have been. But that's likely why he was high needs because he was
Yeah.
trying to tell me something and I didn't understand it. So,
Yep.
yeah, I definitely want to hear what you have to say about both of those things because it's such a
Yeah.
huge piece of that
Yeah.
puzzle.
No, totally. I think that those are, yes, those are two like really big main points. And yes, the misattunement piece I think is huge because similar to you, there have been many situations where I'll just be completely honest, like I was on my phone, like I don't know, I was scrolling on my phone, I was answering a text, like whatever it was, and my son was signaling to me that he needed something. Even now at 2.5, he was asking for something, and because I just wasn't in tune with his world, like I was in my own world, I like missed the sequence of events that led up to whatever the eventual signal was. So like for example, like if he's playing with like his train tracks and he can't get the two pieces together and is getting kind of frustrated and I'm not in tune with him because I'm on my phone or because I'm doing something else or just not in sync with him, kind of like watching what he's doing or aware of it, and I'm not privy to him in that struggle with getting the pieces together, when he eventually has an outburst or a moment of frustration where he like screams or signals or cries, to me, if I'm not in tune with him, that's like, oh my gosh, like what the heck just happened? Like he must,
Hmm.
like he's high needs, those words pop into your head where you're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, like he's, yeah, dysregulated, he's high needs, he's just like having an outburst, whatever it may be. And that's not what happened. What happened was there was a sequence of events that led up to that signal that I was not in tune with or not aware of, and I couldn't sort of be in that sequence of events with him. So I'm just seeing the eventual outcome of that, the outburst, the frustration, the signal, the crying, but I missed like the whole you know journey to get there.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that like we should never let our kids get to that point of frustration or experience that frustration. But I think that in that example, if I had kind of been at least like watching him or being in tune with him as he was navigating that challenging experience of putting the pieces together, I would have known right away, like when he was getting to that point of escalation, and right away knew how to support him, knew how to help him, knew how to down regulate him, help him work through this challenging experience. And it wouldn't have been this moment of mismatch where he was crying and I was like, oh my gosh, like what's he being so upset about, or what's he feeling so disruptive about. And that again is just being human, I think, in a lot of ways. But I feel like sometimes that's where that label comes from of a baby being high needs in sort of a pathologizing way, because there's that mismatch there sometimes where we're just not in attunement because we can't be 100% of the time. And we've talked about this on previous episodes, but that's, I think, sometimes where that happens is we miss those like subtle cues or the sequence of events of an experience for a baby. And then when the outburst comes or the dysregulation or the needs kind of being signaled, then we don't quite understand how we got there. And it takes a moment or two to kind of get back in sync.
Yeah. Yeah, it changes your perspective because had you been in
Hmm.
attuned and you had the insight that tells
Yeah.
you this is what he just went through, then the way that you approach it is different than if it's like it just sort of changes the way that you're perceiving the
Right.
struggle, one of which is like, oh, he was trying to, you meet it with understanding
Hmm.
versus like frustration or
Yeah.
however you're meeting it when you're misattuned.
Right. Going back to your other point too of kind of not knowing your baby well, I say this to parents a lot when I work on sleep consultations with them because a lot of times we talk about um, noticing your baby's tired cues and what their cues are that they're getting tired. And parents will often say, I don't know what my baby's tired cues are. And I think that's totally valid. Sometimes it's hard to know or it's hard to see. And some babies, again, do give very traditional tired cues. They rub their eyes, they yawn, they're tired, and they go to sleep every time, like clockwork. But again, I think that's the outlier. I think the more common scenario is a little bit of clunkiness and trial and error in that relationship between parent and baby as you navigate that relationship and those dynamics and learn what are your baby's tired cues, what are they showing you, not even just with sleep, but with other things, frustration, confusion, anger, sadness, like what are those signs that they're giving you that this is what's happening. And I think motherhood and parenthood in general is unique in that as much as we feel like we may have known our babies forever and we've known these people our entire lives, we love them, in a lot of ways our babies are also strangers to us for a long time. Like it feels like there's this mismatch where I've known you forever, I grew you, my body, like I love you, and I don't know who you are, like you're this like stranger to me,
Yeah.
we don't know each other well yet. And I think that can be really tricky for parents to sort of reconcile, because there's a lot of shame or guilt of feeling like I should know my baby, I should know what they need, I should be able to give them what they need. And that's just not always true. Sometimes we need to have a little bit of trial and error. And I think that it continues to evolve. Like one of the examples I always give when I work with families in sleep consults is when we talk about tired cues, sometimes they're subtle changes in behavior that only a parent or a caregiver who's really in tune would be able to pick up on. So, for example, my son, something that I know is a tired cue for him is that he goes from playing standing up to playing sitting down. So he'll be like playing standing up, like at a table or something like that. And when he starts to get a little tired, he'll move to an activity where he can sit. And that's something that I only picked up on after repeated instances of kind of being in tune with that and knowing like, okay, that's one of his tired cues. He's not going to rub his eyes. He's not, I mean, once in a while he does, but he's not going to, really kind of give these traditional tired cues. There's going to be subtle shifts in his behavior or his energy that I only pick up on because I've learned over many, many months that these are kind of his cues and these are his tells. And that can take a long time to sort of develop that relationship and be really in sync with those things.
Yeah. And I think it can be like contradicting, especially for a parent. Almost every parent is on social media and you have all these posts, you know your baby best, you know this.
Yeah.
I do agree with that 1000%. You know your baby best. And like if you are going to a provider's office and they're like dismissing you and you truly do know your baby best. Like if they're telling you nothing is going on and you feel like something is going on, absolutely, you know your baby best. But also like that and I think that every parent should have like it should happen like in the pediatrician's office. I think like some like fundamental education on like sensory nervous
Mm-hmm.
system, what is co-regulation, attachment, and one of I don't know if you saw, but like one of my posts kind of got ate up on Reddit
Oh
last
no.
week or the week before. And like the accusation was the way that I present parenting is that every parent needs to be a neuroscientist. And
Mm,
I just don't believe that. I think the basic knowledge of like it's just the basics. Like, let's just go over that. Every baby has a sensory system. Every baby has sensory preferences that will help
yeah,
you when it comes to sleep and regulation. Every baby,
yeah,
like, every parent should know about temperament. Every parent, like, all of these things should sort of be foundational because when you don't have that lens to look through, things can seem really high needs when really this
yep,
is a sensory need or a nervous system need, co-regulation. Perhaps this is like completely developmental. Like I think a lot of parents should know about like how babies attach, like so like
yeah,
proximity and then sameness and so that you can see that that's what they're doing. Like they're attaching through, like they're connecting with you through proximity.
hmm,
They're connecting with you through sameness. Like they're not trying to be an annoyance or something like that.
right,
Like they are doing the thing that they are supposed to be doing, and that's not high needs. But how would you know that if we don't have this basic foundation, which I didn't, and I don't
yeah,
think parents do, because why would you? Like I didn't even know the language, so how
yeah.
would I? educate myself surrounding that
Right.
yeah. So I think you don't have to be a neuroscientist to be a
No.
good parent, but like that foundational knowledge really changes the lens through which you approach some of these high needs things that are actually expected.
Yep.
And if you have that foundational knowledge, it sort of makes that high needs not feel high needs and feel biologically normal.
Yep. Totally. Totally. And I think a lot of that comes down to, like you said, parental expectations and also our knowledge or our sort of awareness of how long infancy even is. From a neurobiological perspective, it's the first 3 years of life. 0 to 3 is neurobiological infancy. And I think that gets lost in translation too. We expect like a 1 year old or even a 2 year old to be independent, to be able to self soothe, to be able to kind of be this regulated human, and they're not able to. And even beyond 3, it's slow build. It's not like the day they turn 3 they're able to regulate suddenly and able to be independent and not need us anymore. It's a very slow build, throughout all of childhood. But I think those first 3 years, people hear that and it's a little bit shocking sometimes, just in the way we live our lives societally and culturally. A 3 year old is not seen as a baby anymore, but in a lot of ways they are, or they're just sort of coming out of that infancy. And that can be a really big change in the way people even view parenthood. And I will say to even parents that I work with or friends in my life who have 2 kids or multiple kids under the age of 3, like I will say to them, you have 2 babies right now. Like I know it might not feel that way because your 2 year old might seem much bigger and older, but from like a neurobiological brain development perspective, you have 2 infants right now. And I think sometimes that can be really helpful for people to hear. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. I say that in a very reassuring,
Yeah.
validating way, because I'll work with a lot of families who have, 2 kids under the age of 3 and will say, this feels really hard. Like why is like my 2 year old still not sleeping through the night? Like I need them to be able to sleep through the night so I can deal with the baby, and it's really really challenging to deal with the two of them. And I'll say, you have 2 babies right now, you have 2 infants, and that's why it feels hard, because it is hard. You have 2 infants right now, and that can be, I think, kind of reassuring for people to hear. And I think that's something we need to communicate to parents more openly from the jump.
Yeah, and I think that this like 3 year, and you said it, like it's not like a switch and then like all of
Hmm.
a sudden they're not babies anymore.
Yeah.
I think that like even when we're talking about that time frame, there are a lot of other factors at play. If you don't understand their sensory needs, if you don't
Hmm.
understand some of those things, like that can be extended out.
Yeah.
If your child has an unmet need that they don't have the language for, then you are going to see that manifest as this infant like behavior, because
Hmm.
what else are they supposed to do? That is
Right.
the language that they know. That's how they communicate their needs. And so you can have a 5 or 6 year olds with unmet sensory needs who is still
Hmm.
acting very infant like, and
Hmm.
there's just some unmet needs there, and like that misattunement is there, and that can kind of play a role in
Yep.
that. And I think that when children get to that age 2 or 3, that's when parents really get, I mean, it happens in newborn stage, which is disgusting, but parents can really get into that. They're manipulating you. And if you've read
Hmm.
like Rest, Play, Grow, I think it's Deborah McNamara.
McNamara. Hmm.
She talks about this 5 to 7 shift. And so like, and what is manipulation? And like, you can't manipulate someone unless you understand their perspective, right? Because you have to know what
Hmm.
their perspective is in order to manipulate it. And
Yeah.
children don't even have this ability to hold two perspectives, to understand that you have a perspective until age
Yep.
5 to 7. And even once they do have that ability to understand that you have your own perspective, they don't have the
Hmm.
skill to just like be a master manipulator. And we
Yeah.
can see in children who are neurodivergent or they have other things going on that this shift can really be more like 7 to 9. And
Hmm.
so I think if we could just sort of like spread this awareness, because a lot of parents are just like inundated with this, they're manipulating you, you're coddling them, like that doesn't even exist. That's not even a
Hmm.
thing that they're capable of doing really until they can understand that you also have a perspective and what your perspective is. And that's not occurring until 5 to 7 or 7 to 9.
Yep.
So I think that's really important for parents to
Hmm.
that just piece of information to combat
Yeah,
some of that narrative that they're getting even from like I see posts for newborns like don't do this, you'll create bad habits, or that they're manipulating you. Now you've responded
yeah.
when they cried, so they know that you'll all of that is
There's noise.
garbage.
There's so much noise about all of that, and I think that leads parents to feel even more so like they have a high needs baby if, those sort of messages about, bad habits, being manipulative, self-soothing, like all those buzzwords get thrown around, and then if a baby doesn't fit in that box or doesn't respond well to something like sleep training, for example, um, parents are like, oh my gosh, my baby, can't be sleep trained. They're high needs, things like that. And that's we're missing parts of the conversation there. That's It's not as simple as that. And I think that's where that label gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
Um, and I want to go back to what you said before too. So I think this is a good segue into talking about the situations where a baby truly does have more needs than maybe the typical average baby. And where the label high needs, can be used sometimes, but there's really more to it than that. And this is where I think we can talk about, medical, physical discomfort, red flags that pop up, nervous system differences, neurodivergence, things that like truly can show up in infancy that make a baby um, appear to, have more needs than maybe your friend's baby who's the same age. And I think this is part of my story too, and I'm sure you can relate. But my son really, really struggled with a lot of things, but reflux for the first year of life was like our main factor, and there were sort of like other things kind of branching off of that. Um, and we dealt with the reflux. We were at GI doctors, ENTs, like PT. All we did all the things, and I think that the high needs label resonated with me because to me, like he really did seem to need a lot more than a typical baby. And needing to be held closely, needing to be elevated, needing to sleep on top of me, like a lot of things that really felt challenging. And so I think that, again, when we talk about this high needs label, I don't want to go in either direction. I don't want to say like, oh, we should never use it because it like isn't right or pathologizes a normal baby's experience and what a normal baby does. And I also don't want to go in the other direction of like using it a lot of times. But there are situations, I think, where a baby does have things going on that make it harder for them and harder for you as the parent. So I want to like validate that experience too. And I'm sure you can chime in with that.
In my experience, in my own personal experience, and in the experiences of the majority of the families that I support, sort of the number one barrier to accessing support is this idea of temperament,
Mm-hmm.
or like all babies do this, or you just have a high needs baby. And it really becomes this umbrella that providers, therapists, family members, the general public really tell parents like you're not seeing what you know that you're seeing. I just see it so often. Like it is the most common barrier. So I think both extremes are really harmful. You have to understand both to have a full understanding of a concept because both
Mm-hmm.
things are true. You have to understand what the biologically normal component is and what that should look like. And you have to understand when this is getting to be too much. And unfortunately, this isn't like a chart. Like there's no objective, there's no number of wakes per night that would tell
Mm-hmm.
you something else is going on. The way that your baby communicates, unfortunately, is also something that could be interpreted as, well, they just have a more demanding temperament. And so I think the important piece is like, there needs to be the whole conversation and not just half of it. Like, there is like a temperament or this high needs component, and here are the other things. And if you think about like what that must have been like to have reflux, like if you
Mm-hmm.
like think about that as like a human and what that would have been like for you if you didn't have
Mm-hmm.
language and you couldn't sit up, like you are completely reliant on someone else. I think what really bothers me is that I sort of live in this weird area on the internet, this weird niche, which is like babies, toddlers, preschoolers, and disability rights. I'm supporting a lot of families who have neurodivergent babies or medically complex babies, babies with disabilities, and I see the parallels. Like, I see the oppression of disabled people. I
Mhm.
see how they are gaslit. I see how they don't have resources. I see how their rights are being taken away. And I see, I'm not saying that babies are disabled people, but they truly are dependent people. And they
They're
are
a vulnerable
so,
population.
yes, they are so oppressed. They don't have a voice. And I think one of the things that's really frustrating to me right now is like this physician that's online who has had some issues with her iron. And she has made posts about it, gotten into her stories and talked about it. She's talked about how terrible it was for her, her symptoms, shortness of breath, anxiety, insomnia, palpitations, exercise intolerance, and how lucky for her that she's able to use her words and advocate for an iron infusion. Like, how
Mhm.
nice that must be. But what about the babies with a ferritin of
Mhm.
5?
Mhm.
What about the babies who have reflux? Babies are so oppressed and they're not
Yep.
seen as human. And I think and a lot of people find me polarizing, but I think that there are more babies struggling with underlying conditions than we think. I
Totally.
think that
Totally.
low ferritin is a problem. I think
Mhm.
I see it way too much for it not to be.
Me too.
I see reflux way too much for it not to
Mhm.
be. And
I see
sometimes,
open mouth breathing, airway.
yes,
I see that all the time. I can't tell you the number of times like I've educated about open mouth breathing and parents were like, "Oh my gosh, that's not something that's normal. Like they're not supposed to be doing that." And I'm like, "No, we need to explore that more if they're open mouth breathing." But continue. Yeah.
yes, yeah. The open mouth breathing, like I am seeing families who have had a sleep study and they have a diagnosis, like their sleep study was abnormal. The child has moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea, and the advice is to sleep train. Like,
Yep.
how let's wait, they might grow out of it and just sleep train them. But if your baby were an adult, if your baby were a pediatrician with the ability to order themselves some labs, then something would be done. Never would
Yep.
you tell a human, sorry, you aren't breathing 60 times a night.
Hmm.
Let's just leave you to cry and see what happens. That is
Yes.
not okay. Babies are so oppressed, and I don't know if it's because I'm in this weird niche. People aren't connecting those dots. I don't know where we're losing that, but if they don't have the language to advocate for themselves, you're it. You are
Yeah.
their advocate. And unfortunately, you are going to people who you believe you can trust, and those people are telling you you have a high needs baby.
So
I
mothers
think,
are being oppressed here too.
yeah,
That's, and I actually, this is fresh in my mind because I made a post today. I don't know if you saw it yet, but I made a post about kind of some of my journey through some things with my son. And I was looking back through old messages in his pediatrician portal for this post to like look at some for some context. And I actually had to stop looking because it like gave me a little bit of like a trauma response, like read through some of these messages from even like, 2 years ago now. But I was in the pediatrician's message portal regularly saying like this is what's going on, I'm noticing these symptoms in him, I want to do these tests, I want to explore this further, and getting the runaround basically from the pediatrician and kind of saying that like this is not what's going on, and he was on medication for his reflux, which I now in hindsight like shouldn't have been doing that. And going back to the iron thing, I was asking for iron testing when he was 10 months old, because I said he has these symptoms and that this is what's happening. We didn't end up getting an lab order until his 1 year appointment, but his ferritin came back at 7. His ferritin was 7. So like he had been iron deficient, low ferritin for months at that point, because it doesn't just, happen overnight like that. And it just is this runaround where babies are oppressed, so moms are trying to advocate for them, and then moms are getting shoved down or, again, told high needs, told to sleep train. I've told you the story. My son got a diagnosis of behavioral insomnia of childhood, which I know you hate that diagnosis too. Like these things that are just completely inappropriate. And so not only is the baby not being heard, but the mom who is trying to communicate for her baby on the baby's behalf is not being heard. And it makes you feel crazy. It really does. It makes you feel like a crazy person. And I think that this all kind of loops back to the maternal mental health conversation and lots of other pieces of this journey, because as a mom you start to feel crazy. You're like, I'm trying to advocate for my baby and support them, and I am not being received or heard in the way that I need to be, or the way that I would hope to be.
I think if I remember correctly, we talked about some of that as it was going on, and you shared with me a picture that contained like absolutely inappropriate blaming you in
Oh
your
yeah. Hmm.
son's medical record. Like
Hmm.
that this,
Yes.
you did this, like jaw dropping. And so there's sort of this thing online where people like to tell me a lot, like that's not happening. Nobody's doing that. Nobody's leaving their baby to cry for 12 hours. Nobody's closing the door and walking away. No
Hmm.
pediatrician is telling a parent that it's their fault. Nobody's doing that. But they are.
Discuss behavioral insomnia of childhood, sleep onset association type. Advise to put the patient to bed drowsy but awake to encourage patient to self-soothe. Discuss with caregiver about the infant child's attention-seeking behaviors and reviewed extinction methods to help the patient establish self-soothing skills. Um, the infant should be able to self-soothe and go back to sleep. Um, Avoid going into your child's room at night unless they are sick or clearly require assistance. It's important to send a consistent message that they can and are expected to fall asleep on their own.
And this is for a baby with objective signs and symptoms of several things.
Yes, he had signs and symptoms of struggling with sleep and breathing and neck arching, lots of different things. And I was kind of brushed off. So that was a really tough experience for me, and still kind of processing through that. And it was
Yeah.
a year ago now. Yeah.
Almost every time that I send a parent for a sleep study, they get this normal, or they do like in the findings of the sleep study, it will say several abnormal things, but then they go in for
Hmm.
follow up and they're like, this is nothing. I've seen worse.
Hmm.
But when you're doing a sleep study, and I'm just putting this out there because I think parents should know. One, like you're in a study environment. Like your
Yeah.
child's not going to sleep in the same way that they sleep at home. And a lot of these things, depending on what's going on, some happen during REM sleep, some happen during more sound sleep. Your baby is likely to have more pauses in breathing if that's something they're experiencing for a certain physiological reason. I don't want to get like too into it, but during this sound sleep that they are likely not getting into in a sleep
Hmm.
lab, right?
Yeah.
They're likely not getting into that with all the equipment on them. Many parents don't get the equipment, so you're
Hmm.
told, "Oh, there's no periodic limb movement disorder," but the sensors were not. You don't know. Like
Yeah.
you
We
didn't
couldn't
test
get the
for it. I'm
nasal.
reading.
We could.
Yeah.
We couldn't get
Yeah,
the nasal
I'm
cannula on my son. He didn't have that on the he didn't even have it on for a single second the whole night. The thing that was supposed to measure his like nasal breathing, which is a big part of the whole
yeah.
thing. Didn't even have that. Had zero data for that because we couldn't get it to keep him on.
Yes, and the
So
sneaky thing is then they'll be like, "Well, this was ruled out when I'm the parent has sent me this study. Like you didn't even look for it." Another thing is, oh, they only had 60 periods of apnea. 60 is a lot to me. There was no desaturation, which to me, if you're in a lab environment, perhaps there would have been desaturation had they been able to reach
hmm.
like they're more easily arousable in a lab environment, right?
Hmm.
But then I look at the report and the total length of time that they slept was 120 minutes. So you're telling the parent they only had 60, and that's not connecting because you're going to this expert who's telling you they only had 60 episodes, and then I'm reading the report and they had 60 episodes in 2 hours of sleep in
Yeah.
120 minutes. I'm not a doctor and I'm not diagnosing. And so my job is to say, like, listen, I think that you need a second opinion. Like a lot of times these sleep studies are done through like ENT. There needs to be like a really knowledgeable airway pediatric sleep specialist. It's often a pulmonologist. The person matters. Like you have to have
Yeah.
someone who knows what they're doing and understands that. And most of the time, when parents go get this second opinion, they take the same sleep study and a different doctor wants to do something.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's like a device that the child wears. Sometimes they're like, oh, we need to do something with oral ties. Sometimes they need
Mhm.
tonsils and adenoids. Sometimes they're like scoped in the office, which I think any child that is breathing through their mouth, they need to be scoped. Like you can't rule out tonsils and adenoids
Yeah.
if you're not looking at the tonsils and adenoids. Like it is
Yeah.
so crazy, the
Yeah.
gaslighting and sort of the cavalier attitudes that a lot of these professionals have.
I was basically told to do a behavioral sleep training method for a symptomatic child. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just the gist. On the note of, talking about like the medical side of things and professionals and everything like that, I think something that I also want to incorporate in this conversation is, Lauren, I've talked about this, but sort of the mental load that's associated with having a high needs baby or a highly sensitive baby, a baby that kind of has a little bit more of a challenging time with things. I think there's a mental load associated with that as a parent or a caregiver that doesn't get spoken about enough. And by that, I mean certain things that are easy or not even thought about, maybe by like your parent friends, your mom friends, are really big deals in your life and your household and your child's life. Some examples that I can think of are like going to the dentist for my son, for example. A huge we haven't had a successful dentist appointment yet. We've been a few times, and every time we go, they can't even get in his mouth to look without it being a really, really dysregulating experience for him. And then we have some friends that have kids the same age where their kids went to their first dentist appointment, sat in the chair, opened their mouth. The dentist was able to do the cleaning, was able to do everything they needed to do, no problem. Kid left happy, smiling. There was no like, upset there. And nothing is wrong with either kid. I'm not like, blame, like, there's nothing negative that I'm saying here, but the mental load associated with something like that is that in my life, whenever my son needs to go to the dentist or the doctor or has an appointment coming up, for the weeks leading up to that appointment, I am in my head. I'm anxious, I'm worried, I'm dreading this appointment. I'm thinking about all the logistics of, does my husband need to take off work? Does he need to come with us? Do I need to arrange for the afternoon off of work for myself so that I can co-regulate with him afterwards? Do I need to like do all these things to prep for this appointment? Like, and for the weeks leading up to it, I'm losing sleep. I'm worrying about it because I know that taking him to the dentist, taking him to the doctor, taking him for blood work, whatever it may be, is going to be a really, really stressful experience for him and for me. And that mental load, I think, is something that is unique and you don't really get it unless you've experienced it or you've had a child who has that sort of temperament, high needs, whatever we want to call it. And that can feel really isolating because I know for me, like, like talking to some of my friends who just bring their kids to the dentist or the doctor and it's like no big deal and they just go on with their day. I can't relate to that because for us, like, it is the whole day. Like, I need to make sure my husband's off of work. I need to make sure we have, logistics figured out. And so that's just one example. Even things, more simple than that, going to the bathroom, like you said, taking a shower, like, these are things that I think sometimes if you have a kid with a little bit more of an easygoing temperament or personality, going to the bathroom is like not a huge deal. You can put them down, they can play independently for a few minutes and you can go to the bathroom. Whereas like in my experience, me going to the bathroom is a really big deal for my son for some reason, like very dysregulating for him. And it's a whole process where like I need to either, make sure he's set up with something that's going to be regulating for him, or I need to take him with me, or I need to put him on my lap while I go to the bathroom. Like, and this has been our experience, his entire life. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not, upset about that, but it does make our experiences of motherhood different. That's what I'm getting at is like, I love my son and everything about him, and I'm more than happy to sit him on my lap while I go to the bathroom. I don't have a problem doing that at all if that's what he needs. And that makes my experience of motherhood very different than the mother sitting next to me who can go to the bathroom, take a shower, work out, and her kid will play independently for that entire time. That's a very different experience.
Yeah. I think that like I really strongly relate to the bathroom situation, and I think like people are like it's not that deep,
Yeah.
and this might make me sound incredibly odd, but I have developed, and I have actually started seeing someone and talking about this. So I have a little bit of like genuine PTSD surrounding not being able to go to the bathroom. And
Hmm.
I have developed these like compulsions around I can't go outside without going to the bathroom. I can't, like, if we're getting ready to go out, I start feeling panicky and I like pee like 5 times
Hmm.
before we go out because I'm like, oh, I
Hmm.
won't be able to go to the bathroom. I won't be able to go. And some of that is my son is like terrified of public restrooms. He will not go in. And so especially if we're going like I start restricting my fluid, I start like there's this whole
Hmm.
like plan that has to and like people would never even consider that going to bed. Like I have a really hard time with using the restroom around like
Hmm.
before I go to bed because I don't know. And a lot of this like is from when he was an infant. Like if I put him
Yeah.
down, he would start crying and once he started crying, he would cry for hours. So
Yeah.
I just held it. And like it has really turned into a thing that I am
Yeah.
seeking therapy for. And that's just
Hmm.
going to the back. It is that deep. It can
It is
be
that deep.
that
Hmm.
deep. And like talking to like this therapist who's like, well, this is, I was like, oh, it's like a coping thing. She was like, well, that's a compulsion. Like, that's not a
Yeah.
coping
Hmm.
thing. um, so, like, and I'm not so deep in therapy that I know what to do about it, but like I have at least recognized like this is
Hmm.
something that happened. And
Yeah.
I think like when you're talking about like taking a child to, so highly sensitive children are more prone to being, you know, traumatized by some of these things. Like a blood draw can be, and people want to be like, you need to really not be using the word traumatized. It can really be
Hmm.
traumatizing for
Yeah.
both the parent and the child. And you can really get wrapped up in weeks before not being able
Yeah.
to sleep and trying to figure out like the logistics of it. Do you prep or do you not? Like, I have
Right.
had some really bad experiences with prepping. I have, like, he will get anxious. Like, I don't want him
Yeah.
to be anxious for 2 weeks. I want to prep him.
Yeah.
So like it's just sort of like you can't win. Like I don't want him to be completely unprepared, but sometimes the prep will lead to anxiety. And for him, if something like that occurs, it really impacts him afterwards. And it can be for months or, you know, we had this school event that happened that he is even, his brothers recently just went back to school. And so the school buses are back. And he has even expressed, and this is 3 years later, like, I'm not going to school. He has tied this to teachers, I think, which is more
Mm.
easily, like, I'm more easily able to understand where his fear is now because he has more language. But this fear is with teachers, I think,
Yeah.
and like he doesn't want to see a teacher, he doesn't want to be exposed to a teacher or be around a teacher,
Hmm.
and like he's doesn't want to get on the bus. And like this happened 3 years ago and he's still talking about this, and people are like, well, at some point that's you, like you've brought this up, which I haven't and I don't. But that is sort of what parents are going
Yeah.
through. And when we're talking about like the medical intervention piece of it, many parents aren't successful. Like you go to the dentist, it's not, you have accomplished something, right? Like you've gone
Yeah.
and there's like, you're slowly introducing it, hopefully, because some
Hmm.
dentists are like, well, we'll just put their arms on arm boards and hold them down. And that I completely
Yeah.
disagree with.
Me too.
Um,
Hmm.
but like sometimes it might take 8 or 10 times, but sometimes you don't have that ability. Sometimes
Yeah.
there's a medical thing going on. My son was really sick once and had to have an IV and a blood draw, and we were like in an emergency room sort of situation. And it took me and 4 nurses, 5 of us. My husband left the room and we held him down to get labs and an IV. I think that when we're talking about sleep studies or imaging, I've worked with a lot of parents who have like brain malformation. The child does have like brain
Yeah.
malformations
Yeah.
and stuff. And like, not only does the parent have to push, like, first they're told they're crazy and this isn't going on. And so the parent's pushing, pushing, pushing. So that's part of it. And they're being gaslit. And then they get finally someone to order it and then it doesn't work. Like,
Yeah.
what that feels like. And like, there's just like this whole a lot of neurodivergent children, like when you go to a set, like you need the labs, you don't get them.
Yeah.
You need the imaging and it doesn't work. So you're going back and forth. And sometimes that second and third time that you're going back, like now your child knows what's in that building. Like
Yeah.
it's progressing. So there's sort of like this whole behind the scenes aspect of that that people aren't even aware of that can
Right.
be really taxing on parents too. That I think is part of that sort of more highly sensitive temperament
Yeah.
trait, even. Your child doesn't have to be neurodivergent to struggle more with like a medical setting.
Right. Yeah. And it's, yes, and it weighs on the parent heavily, I think.
Yeah.
And that, piece of it is really, really, really taxing. The other thing that comes up with that, and this is kind of a good segue, is supporting parents through this experience of maybe having a highly sensitive child or high needs child. Like a lot of the work that I do, even in sleep consults, is helping parents, see what is in your control right now and what can you do to support yourself and regulate yourself and, give yourself that expanded capacity to support your child. Because I think a lot of times what we see as like a high needs baby is a parent who is at their capacity and at a loss of how to expand that capacity. And it just feels too heavy to take on the child as they are because the parent's capacity is already stretched too thin. And so a lot of times that work that we do is about, again, education of what's normal, how to be in tune with your baby and how to really see them for who they are versus trying to fit them into a box of a schedule that you see online or the babies that you see on social media or even like your friends in real life, actually tuning into the baby in front of you and regulating your own nervous system, your own mindset, your own expectations, and really focusing on what is in your control in the moment. And it can be really, really minor things. And for example, for me, something that has completely changed my experience of like my son's sleep journey has been, I call it sort of romanticizing bedtime or romanticizing the nights. And I've heard this phrase before, I didn't like come up with it, but something as simple as making sure I always have my AirPods with me when I'm supporting him to sleep, not to drown out him, but to give myself something to listen to, like a podcast or an audiobook or something that I'm looking forward to listening to, gives me a little bit more a sense of control in a situation that might otherwise be unpredictable. So I might not know how long it's going to take him to fall asleep. I might not know, when he was really young and we were waking up a lot overnight, I might not know how long this night wake is going to be or what it's going to, entail, but I have control over what I'm going to listen to in my AirPods while I do this and while I support him. And that helps me regulate my nervous system. So really focusing on like those little things that help you expand your capacity to support your child, I think can make a big difference because the focus in our culture tends to be so heavy on how can I change my child or how can I fix my child? How can I fix their sleep? How can I make them fit into this box or make them do XYZ? And I think the more important conversation is you can't make your child fit into that box. I mean, you can, I guess, if you want to employ some behavioral methods like sleep training or timeouts and punishments and those types of things. But if that's not your jam, the truth is you're not going to be able to fit your child into a box, but you can expand your own capacity to be able to support them in the way that they need. And I think that needs to be more of the conversation.
Yeah. I think if I had earpods and during those like especially during infancy when there was a lot of long night
Mhm.
wakes where he was very upset, had I been excited to listen to a book or something like that experience would have been very
Exactly.
different. I think
Yep.
too, when we talk about like your capacity, especially for parents who are navigating like this one end of this where it is a medical need or something like that,
Hmm.
like you don't have to fix like most of these things are not emergencies.
Hmm.
So you
Yep.
can like my son still has some things going on that we have opted to wait to address
Yep.
because
Us
it's
too.
too much for him, it's too much for me, and we just need to wait. Like now's not the right time to do that. It would be really
Yep.
harmful for his mental health. It would make me very anxious. And that's okay to do that. And in the beginning, I didn't have that mindset. Like I was really pushing him. I felt like, well, I'm like leaving him to suffer.
Yeah.
but he was suffering more because I was like taking him
Hmm.
to all these appointments and doing all of these things. And so we have some of these diagnoses. He clearly has an oral tie. He does still have sleep disordered breathing, and like I just
Yeah.
he it would not be good for him if I did those
Yep.
things right now. And so I think
Totally.
that you can also expand your capacity that way if you just like pump the brakes and like I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like just
Yeah.
like a lot of these things like we're saying like these are big bad things and parents are being gaslit and well I'm saying that. But like but and again and like sometimes it is more harmful to go full speed and like do things very quickly. And there's only so many things you can do at once. So for a lot
Yep.
of parents that I'm seeing, there's a lot of things going like they're in therapy and they've got some medical things going on. Like you have to be realistic about what your nervous system can handle and
Yep.
theirs.
Yep.
And if you are both just so dysregulated all the time because you're doing all of these things that are creating a lot of anxiety or trauma or like sort of these
Yep.
lasting things, like that isn't good either. So you have to
Hmm.
really, there's a lot of nuance, and I spend a lot of time working with parents. Like, what would you do first? Like, what avenue would you? And that is not dependent on me. That's dependent on the baby and the parent, and like
Yep.
what is their capacity. So it's
Yep.
really something that's really hard to discuss on social media or even in a podcast because it's so nuanced and
Yep.
so dependent.
Yeah, no, totally. I've had the same experience where I think there's a bit of a um, for me at least, when my son was in early infancy, I felt this like pressure to get answers and solutions like tonight. Like I was like, I need something like, and that's how you feel when you're desperate, when you're in the depths of it, when you're sleep deprived, when you're really, really struggling. There is this survival instinct that kicks in where you're like, I'm going to find an answer. I'm going to find a solution. Tonight's going to be different. Like everything's going to be fixed, tonight. And for a long time I was operating on that too of like I need to do this, I need to find answers, like I'm going to doctors, I'm going to specialists, I'm googling, I'm researching, like the whole shebang. And I think part of it is it made me feel like I was in control or in at least trying to be in control. But I totally agree with you. We had a similar experience where at some point I was just like, this is too much, like this is too much on him, it's too much on me, like we need to take a step back and pause. And there are certainly some things that similar to you, like we are just not addressing right now. I'm not saying we're not addressing them ever, but we needed to take a pause, and it'll be easier to address those things once we're a little bit, both of us are a little bit more regulated and he's a little bit older, and we can look at it, through a clearer lens. And like you said, it's not an emergency in most cases.
Yeah, I think too with age or your child's ability to communicate with like spoken language
Hmm.
and their understanding, like their ability to hear from you what to expect and
Yep.
understand what to expect, some of these things do become easier. And so like you gotta there's two things happen, like yes we want to address these things but like we want to do it in a way that is like the least traumatic or dysregulating to
Mhm.
both.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of I Don't Know Who Needs to Hear This. Again, I'm Gabrielle and I'm here with Lauren, and we hope that you enjoy this episode. Please let us know on social media what you thought, and like, comment, subscribe, follow along the podcast so you don't miss any new episodes. And we will chat with you next time.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.